Good morning, students. We'll continue with our LCD in the interior of the skull. Now, yesterday we had seen that the interior of the skull was divided into anterior cranial fossa, the middle cranial fossa, and the posterior cranial fossa. Now, today we are going to study about the middle cranial fossa. You can see that this middle cranial fossa, it is more deeper as compared to the anterior cranial fossa, and the shape of this middle cranial fossa is somewhat butterfly shaped. It has got a central part, central narrow median part, and lateral deep and wide parts. These are the lateral parts of the middle cranial fossa. So now let us focus on the middle cranial. So now let us study the parts of the middle cranial fossa. This is the median part. Now this median part is formed by the body of the sphenoid. What are the parts that are present? In the anterior part, this is the sulcus chiasmaticus, and behind this is the hypophyseal fossa. First, let us discuss about the sulcus chiasmaticus. As I already told you, the sulcus chiasmaticus does not lodge the optic chiasma. That is the crossing over of the second cranial nerve, that is the optic nerve. In fact, the optic chiasma lies slightly above it. So, this is the sulcus chiasmaticus. On either side of the sulcus chiasmaticus, if you see, you are seeing two foramina on the lateral side. If I put a probe, into these foramina, you can see that the foramina is opening in the orbit. So these are the optic canals. So on either side of the sulcus chiasmaticus, you have the optic canals. These optic canal, through these optic canals passes the optic nerve and the ophthalmic artery. Let us see the next structure in the midline, that is the hypophyseal fossa. This is the hypophyseal fossa, which is also called as sella turcica. Why it is called as sella turcica? It is shaped like a Turkish saddle. So that is why it is called as sella turcica. So what are the boundaries? This ridge, this prominent ridge what you are seeing is called as a tuberculum celli. Now we have already seen this is the sulcus chiasmaticus. So this tuberculum celli, this ridge is the tuberculum celli. This ridge forms the posterior limit of the sulcus chiasmaticus. Now on either side of the tuberculum celli, you will see two prominent tubercles. These are called as the middle clinoid process. We have already seen this is the lesser wing of the sphenoid, and these are the anterior clinoid processes. The anterior clinoid process, it gives attachment to the free margin of the tentorium cerebelli. So this is the tuberculum celli, and on the lateral end it shows small tubercles. These are called as the middle clinoid process. Sometimes the middle clinoid process and the anterior clinoid process both are joined by a ligament, that is called as the carotidoclinoid ligament. And when the middle and the anterior clinoid process are joined by the carotidoclinoid ligament, this area is converted into a foramen, which is called as the carotidoclinoid foramen. Through this carotidoclinoid foramen, the internal carotid artery passes. Now, let's come to the next thing, that is the hypophyseal fossa. This hypophyseal fossa, it lodges the pituitary gland or the hypophysis cerebri. This is forming the roof of the sphenoidal air sinuses. So underneath this are the sphenoidal air sinuses. Okay. Now the posterior part of this hypophyseal fossa, again you will find a prominent ridge. This is called as dorsum celli. On either side, again the dorsum celli, it shows prominent tubercles which are called as the posterior clinoid process. So this is the anterior clinoid process, this is the middle clinoid process, and on either side of the dorsum celli you have the posterior clinoid process. This is tuberculum celli, this is the dorsum celli. Now on either side of this hypophyseal fossa you will see groove structures, a very shallow groove. See, in this region, this is the hypophyseal fossa. Here in this region you will see two shallow grooves. These are called as the carotid grooves. These are the carotid grooves. So these carotid grooves, they lodge the internal carotid artery. The internal carotid artery, it comes out to the foramen lacerum. This foramen is the foramen lacerum. So it comes out to the upper end of the foramen lacerum. It travels in this carotid canal, okay, and then passes medial to the anterior clinoid process. This area, here you have the cavernous sinus, and one of the contents in the cavernous sinus is the internal carotid artery surrounded by sympathetic plexus of nerves. So here on either side of the hypophyseal fossa, here is the site of the cavernous sinus. Now we have seen the features in the median part. Now let us study about the lateral parts of this middle cranial fossa. Now what are the bones which are forming the lateral parts? This bone, what you are seeing, is the greater wing of the sphenoid. This is the lesser wing of sphenoid. This is the greater wing of sphenoid. And this portion, it belongs to the temporal bone. This is the squamous part of the temporal bone. You can see over here, I am showing the view of the skull from the lateral side. So this portion of the bone, this is the squamous part of the temporal bone. So if you see the interior of the skull, this portion is the squamous part of temporal bone. This is greater wing of sphenoid, and this raised triangular area what you are seeing on either side, this is the petrous part of the temporal bone. So this is the petrous part of temporal bone. This is squamous part of temporal bone. Now this middle cranial fossa, it lodges the temporal lobes of the cerebrum. Now if you see, this is the greater wing of the sphenoid. This greater wing of the sphenoid, it is concave, and in a concentric line if you see, it presents certain foramina. Now see, just below the lesser wing of the sphenoid, you are seeing this oblique shaped groove. This oblique shaped groove is the superior orbital fissure. If I put my probe through this groove, here I am showing you the orbit. You can see the probe emerging in the orbit in an oblique shaped fissure. This oblique shaped fissure is the superior orbital fissure. So the superior orbital fissure, as you can see, it is an oblique shaped fissure which is directed laterally and forwards, and it is broad in the medial part whereas narrow in the lateral part. So anteriorly it is formed by the lesser wing of the sphenoid. Posterior margin is formed by the greater wing of the sphenoid, and medially this is the body of the sphenoid. The structures passing to the superior orbital fissure will be discussed in the orbit. Now next, in the concentric circles, again you will see a small foramen over here. This is the foramen rotundum. This foramen rotundum transmits the maxillary nerve from the trigeminal ganglion to the pterygopalatine fossa. So this is the foramen rotundum. This is the foramen rotundum. Through this passes the maxillary nerve. Just behind the foramen rotundum, again here you can see an oval shaped foramen. This is the foramen ovale. Now if I put my probe through the foramen ovale, now you can see over here I put my probe in the foramen ovale, okay, and you can see the location of the foramen ovale in the base of the skull. I have already put a probe and you can see the location in the base of the skull. So if you see from the norma bisalis side, this is the foramen ovale. Through the foramen ovale, 4 structures they pass. That is mandibular nerve, accessory meningeal artery, lesser petrosal nerve, and the emissary vein. These can be remembered by the mnemonic MALE, M-A-L-E, mandibular nerve, accessory meningeal artery, lesser petrosal nerve, and the emissary vein. Okay. Remember, all of you have to identify these foramen in the exams, and you have to tell the structures passing through the foramen. Just posterolateral to it, the foramen ovale, you will find another very small foramen. Just posterolateral to it. This is the foramen spinosum. This foramen spinosum transmits the nervus spinosus and the middle meningeal artery. Nervus spinosus is the meningeal branch of the mandibular nerve. This is the foramen spinosum. So the structures passing to the foramen spinosum are the middle meningeal artery and nervus spinosus, that is the meningeal branch of the mandibular nerve. Just medial to the foramen ovale, here you will see this irregular shaped opening. This is the foramen lacerum. Here you can see this is the foramen lacerum. On the inner surface of the squamous temporal bone, just lateral to the foramen spinosum, you will see deep groove. This groove lodges the middle meningeal artery. The middle meningeal artery, it later divides into anterior branch and the posterior branch. Now let us come to the third part of the temporal bone, that is the petrous part of the temporal bone. This raised triangular area, this is the petrous part of the temporal bone. Now what are the features? This is the apex of the petrous part of temporal bone. So in the anterior part over here, you will see a fossa or a depression. Here you can see in the anterior part of the petrous temporal bone, there is a fossa or a depression. This is called as trigeminal impression. Over here lodges the trigeminal ganglion. And this trigeminal ganglion, it is covered by a fold of dura mater forming a trigeminal cave. Similarly, in the midline, as I already told you, the pituitary gland is lodged over here. The roof of this hypophyseal fossa, it is formed by diaphragma celli. Now this diaphragma celli, it is nothing but a fold of dura mater, and anteriorly it is attached to the tuberculum celli and posteriorly attached to the dorsum celli. Now, on the petrous part of the temporal bone, here you are seeing a prominent elevation. This area is called as arcuate eminence. Underneath the arcuate eminence is the anterior semicircular canal of the internal ear. Anterior semicircular canal of the internal ear. Now, just lateral to the trigeminal impression, here is the trigeminal impression. Just lateral to it, you are seeing a groove. This is the trigeminal impression. Just lateral to the trigeminal impression, you are seeing a groove. This is the hiatus and groove for the greater petrosal nerve. You will see that this groove, it leads to the foramen lacerum. This is the foramen lacerum. So this hiatus and groove is for the greater petrosal nerve, which leads to the foramen lacerum. Another, just lateral to it, you will see another hiatus and groove. This shallow groove is for the lesser petrosal nerve, which leads to the foramen ovale. So this is hiatus and groove for the lesser petrosal nerve. This is the hiatus and groove for the greater petrosal nerve. Now, just lateral to the arcate eminence, here in this region, you will see an irregular plate of bone. This is the arcuate eminence. In this region here, you will see an irregular plate of bone. That is the tegmen tympani. This tegmen tympani, it forms a common roof for the mastoid antrum, tympanic cavity, and the bony part of the auditory tube. If you see, the lateral part of this tegmen tympani, it projects into the squamotympanic fissure. Now what is the squamotympanic fissure? Now, this is the external auditory meatus. This is the zygomatic arch. This is the mandibular fossa. Now, if you see from the norma basalis side, again this is the mandibular fossa. This is the tympanic plate. Okay. Now, this fissure, over here is the squamotympanic fissure. You can see this plate of bone, small plate of bone projecting in the squamotympanic fissure. This is nothing but the lateral end of the tegmen tympani. This is the lateral end of the tegmen tympani, which projects into the squamotympanic fissure. So, here is the location of the tegmen tympani. So, these are the features that we had studied in the middle part as well as the lateral part of the middle cranial fossa.